Hey everyone, so I've been using this thing called Flask a lot, which is a Python-based library which can make really good web applications very simply. And I decided from looking around I didn't see very many tutorials on it, so I decided to do a video tutorial series. And this is the first part. So for the first part I'm going to explain what I expect from people coming into this lesson. I expect that people at this lesson have a pretty decent idea of programming, like nothing special, but knowing your data structures, knowing how a program kind of like looks. You don't necessarily have to know Python to do this because Python is a pretty intuitive language, and no matter which background you come from, you can probably figure out what's going on in this lesson. So let's just start right now. The first thing I did was I made a directory called Flask tutorial, and this is where we're going to start. The first thing to do, by the way, I'm using Python 3.4. I recommend you use it too, but it shouldn't make too much of a difference no matter which version you use. Except for like if you do prints or like tiny things like that, it might make a little bit of a difference. Either way, the first thing I like to do is get started by setting up a virtual environment. And you can give it whatever name you want, but the command to do that is pyvenv and then your directory name as the first argument. And it takes a second, and there you go. Now you'll notice Flask, the virtual environment we just made, is right there. You'll also notice I have Flask docs in here. I just kind of like them to have them handy. I don't know why. Anyway, to start in your virtual environment, use source, your directory name, /bin, /activate. And now you'll see that little thing next to my prompt. It says Flask. That means I am in my own separate instantiation of Python in a way. And I can install stuff into this instantiation without messing with my global Python. I can also use Python 3.4 without like changing my global Python, which is another reason I like it. Anyway, now that we have this, we're going to install something. But before we install it, what I really recommend you do, while you're going along, is make this file called requirements.txt. And what I want you to put in here is anything you install. And what we're going to install is Flask. That's it, just Flask. And the reason I want you to do this is so if someone else is coming into your project, they can actually install everything out of this requirements.txt right away without having to worry about import errors or anything. They can just recursively install everything in the file. Anyway, the next thing that we're going to do is actually install Flask. It's going to take a second, but it's pretty easy to download. It kind of does a lot of stuff for you. Some things are a lot harder to download. It's kind of annoying. And now I'm actually going to open Atom, which is a text editor. But let's see. Flask tutorial. And let's open up that. Now, we'll see our requirements.txt, our bin, and here's a Flask docs. I doubt it'll open. Yep, it doesn't really open well. Anyway, let's make our first file. And this will be called, well, it doesn't really matter what you call it, but let's just call it app.py because that's how you usually start. The first thing that you're going to want to do is from Flask, import Flask. Now what is this? This is really just kind of the base class that kind of sets everything up for your Flask application. The next thing you need to do is actually instantiate the class. And there's only one parameter that you actually need to pass in, and that's called the import name. Right now, what you're going to need to know about the import name is since we are not using a Python module, we can just pass in this name, which will give it an idea of where to import everything from. If you want some better idea about what other things you can change within this with the optional parameters, I've left a link in the description below. Anyway, the next thing that we're going to have to do is make a static route. And what a route uses in Flask is this thing called a decorator. Decorators in Python are kind of this concept of wrapping a function in another function. So I'm going to show you real quick, just as an example. I'm not actually going to run this program, but I think it will give you a better idea of how Flask works. Let's make this thing called function wrapper, right? And it's going to take in a function as one of its parameters. And then we're going to use this wrap s thing. And we're going to put another function here. And we're going to pass it args and keyword arguments. The next thing that we're going to do, now that we've done that, is we're just going to print this is run before. Just saying this is run before you actually run your function. Then you can return f with args and keyword arguments. And, then you just have to return wrapper. And now you can do something kind of like this. I don't think you can actually call stuff function, but that's a whole different story. And maybe you can see why this would have an implication for routing, but other languages kind of have like this table-looking thing, or some other languages have this table-looking thing, where you kind of define what every route does. Flask does that a little more inline, and I always kind of preferred that. Anyway, this was just a basic thing to get you the idea of what's happening. But let's make our route. We're going to call it index, because it's just the page at slash. What we're going to do is we're simply going to return hi. That's all you need to return. We're not going to do anything fancy for the first lesson, sorry. The next part is going to be this if name equals main block. And the reason for this is you might import your flat or you might import your app to other functions, but you're not going to want what happens in the block below this to happen when you import it. And if you don't know what if name equals main means, it's kind of a way to control the execution of your function. But if I was to go into my terminal and do python app.py, it would have the name main because I just ran it directly, so it would be the main function. Anyway, all we need to do here is simply app.run, and you're set. Let's go into a web browser. It will be running on, actually, sorry, but before, you're definitely going to have to run this. And you'll see that it's now running on port 127.0.0.1, port 5000. Let's go there. And look at that. Now it says hi. It's not really that special. And because it's not that special, I think we need to make it a little more interesting. How about we add some real, actual HTML? Flask uses this templating language called Jinja, which is very powerful for what it is, but you might have used other templating languages before. I think like Handlebars is a popular one, EJS is the other one I used, which were more like front-end ones. Anyway, now we have this render template, and it's a function, and with it, you can return HTML pages, and they'll be rendered the way you expect them to. But you might be wondering where these HTML pages are actually coming from. Actually, one of the names in here, in this Flask object, is where your template folder is. And your template folder is where you're going to keep all of these HTML files. You can also change it if you want. You can change it to whatever path you really want relative to the app. But let's not worry about that because it's really not that important. We're going to make a templates folder, which is the default, and we're going to make a file called index.html. Now, I'm not going to do anything amazing, but I'm just going to demonstrate to you that you can make HTML just this easily. Okay, and now you have a really, really basic template. And now it's going to return actual HTML when it goes here. And let's restart this. And let's go here. See? Now it's actually giving you some real HTML that is actually pretty cool. I think that's going to do it for the first lesson. Actually, now that I think of it, there's one more thing you should know. You should definitely start before you get into the next lesson. And that's what happens if you run into problems. What happens if this has a problem in it? Something like that. It doesn't really matter. But I'm going to show you what happens if you have a problem in it. Oh, so I guess it'll catch that one. But let's say law equals. It will catch that one when it tries to compile it because it makes sense. What's this? Just internal server error. Well, that's not very informative. It doesn't give you any idea of where anything went wrong. There are several lines of defense for this, but right now we're just going to start with the simplest one. And that's, in this app.run, there are a few optional parameters, one of which is debug, which will give you a debugger so you can see exactly what's going on in your application when it does fail. Let's try this again and see what actually happens. Oh, what's this? A view function didn't return a response. That's a lot more informative. So let's go here, and let's make it actually return a response. Alright, now it's actually returning something, so there shouldn't be a debugger there. Yep. Another thing you should know about this debugger, before we continue, do not use this on production for really any reason, because it can allow them to execute code and you do not want that. We're far away from production, but just know that ahead of time. So don't leave this on if you're going to put this on like a real visible website. And that's going to do it for the first lesson.